Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. If you're one of my students, we have already talked about different types of elections, comparing congressional and presidential elections, and also primary and general elections. And what we're going to do now is look a little bit at how these campaigns and elections are paid for, with a very brief introduction to campaign finance. We're not going to go into all of the specific groups that finance elections today, but we're going to talk a little bit about the basic rules and regulations that govern campaign finance in the United States. So by the time this video is over, what you should be able to do is talk about the different categories of campaign contributions in the United States, the most common ones anyway, and explain how the government became involved in regulating campaign finance. I'll also be able to identify what some of the limits are on contributions by individuals and various groups in the political landscape. You should also be able to identify these terms: Political Action Committee or PAC, Federal Election Commission, matching funds, and the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. So let's go ahead and get started. In the United States, there are four broad categories of campaign contributions that are generally referred to. The first and most frequent or most common are small individual contributions. These are contributions up to about $200. This is just made by average everyday people who contribute $10 here, $15 there to a presidential or congressional or gubernatorial campaign, whatever. There's also large individual contributions, which are characterized as contributions of being more than $200. There are contributions that come from what are called political action committees. Those are groups that collect donations or contributions from their members and then distribute those contributions to candidates whom the PAC supports. And there's also self-financing. You don't see this as much in presidential elections, but there are some examples of it. Ross Perot most notably gave a large sum of his own money to finance his primaries in 1992 when he was running as an independent candidate, since he did not have party backing. These are, again, the four primary types of campaign contributions. So if you're one of my students, make sure you know each of these. The government began to become involved in campaign finance in the early 1970s, and the need for it was really driven home by the Watergate scandal, which occurred in the early 1970s, began with the break-in at the Watergate Hotel in 1972, which is where the Democratic National Committee's headquarters was housed. Eventually, it was found that people working for Richard Nixon's re-election campaign had authorized the break-in, and then of course Richard Nixon had covered it up. But over the course of that investigation, it was discovered that the Nixon campaign, and the Democrats as well, but primarily Nixon, since that was the focus of the Watergate investigation, was engaging in campaign improprieties, things like promising ambassadorships to big-time campaign donors and things like that. So the influence of big money and corruption became fairly apparent to a lot of people in the American government. And so an organization or a group was put together to regulate federal campaign finance, and that was the Federal Election Commission, which was first seated in 1974. It has 6 members, and what they do is set limits and regulations on campaign contributions and sort of monitor goings on in elections and make sure there are no financial improprieties going on. They set limits when they were founded in 1974, and then those limits have adjusted with the value of America's dollar over the course of the last 40 years or so. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those limits and rules that are in place regarding campaign finance. One of the main things to look at on this chart right now is what can be given to each candidate by various entities. Individuals, as of 2013, can give $2,600 to a candidate in a given election cycle. Now, individuals can support more than one candidate, but you can only give $2,600 to each candidate in each election cycle. Candidates can also get $5,000 from the National Party Committee, the Republican National Committee, or Democratic National Committee. Political action committees can also give up to $5,000 if they're multi-candidate. Say it's a political action committee that just in general supports Democratic candidates. They can give $5,000 to each candidate. If it's a PAC for just one candidate, it's subject to the $2,600 limit that individuals are subjected to. Be sure you reference this chart as we go through our discussion of campaign finance. You can also find this chart on the Federal Election Commission website. That's where I shamelessly stole it from. So go take a look at that and take a look at the various limits. And we'll be talking more about these groups as we go through our discussion of campaign finance. So again, make sure you reference this chart if needed. Now, that chart deals primarily with private contributions to campaigns by individuals, political action committees, political parties, and so on and so forth. But there's also public financing of elections in the United States. Congressional elections are totally privately financed by individual contributions, the candidate's own money, and so on and so forth. But presidential elections in the United States are, to a degree, publicly funded. And here's how it works. There's a fund set up by the Department of the Treasury in the United States called the Presidential Election Campaign Fund that is contributed to by people who choose to contribute to it by indicating such on their tax return. Every year when you do your taxes, you have to check a box on the tax return form if you want $3 of your tax that you owed that year to go to the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. It doesn't affect your refund. It doesn't affect the amount of money you actually owe the government or anything like that. But $3 of the tax you had owed goes into this account, this pot, this fund, whatever. And during presidential primaries is when the money first is used. Candidates can get matching funds for their own individual contributions. So if they get a contribution of $250 from a person, then the government will kick in an additional $250 and match that donation. They will only match each donation up to $250. Now, not everybody can get this. You have to be a serious candidate. You can't just be some nut job out there saying you're running for president. You have to prove that you can raise a decent amount of money from a wide base of people. So you have to raise at least $5,000 in at least 20 different states through small contributions. So you can't just get 20 rich people in 20 states to give you $5,000. You've got to go out and get it from a bunch of different people, because no matter how much money someone gives you, you can only count $250 of that towards your count to be considered for matching funds. Also, you have to be part of a political party that got at least 5% of the vote in the last presidential election, which is a pretty tough bar to hit. Ross Perot got matching funds from the government in 1996 because he had been a candidate who got 19% of the vote in 1992. Pat Buchanan, the Reform Party candidate, got matching funds in 2000 based on the Reform Party's performance in 1996. But that's the last time that it has actually occurred. Once the primaries are gotten through, and if you are the candidate who has survived the primary and become your party's nominee, you get public financing for your general election campaign as well. When this fund was set up in the 1970s, they set the number at $20 million, that each major party candidate would get $20 million to run their general election campaign if they wanted to take it. Now, there were catches. If you took the Presidential Election Campaign Fund money to run your general election campaign, you couldn't spend more than $50,000 of your own money from that point forward. You had to use that money for only campaign-related expenses. You couldn't go out and buy a car with it to drive around on vacation. You, from that point forward, can't accept private money from individuals or political action committees. And you have to give back any of the money you don't end up spending. If you don't take the money from the government, you don't have to adhere to any of those rules. Now, as time went on and as inflation decreased the value of the dollar, the amount of money that the candidates have gotten during the general election campaign has increased to the point where in 2008, each campaign was offered $84.1 million by the government. And from 1976 to 2004, everybody took the money. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first presidential candidate in a general election to refuse the money offered to him for public campaign finance because he figured he could just raise a lot more on his own. And then in 2012, Obama and Romney both opted out because they could get more money from elsewhere. Just as a side note, the presidential election campaign fund will also pay for the major parties' conventions. In 2012, each of the two major parties got $18.2 million for organization and security associated with their party conventions in Tampa and in Charlotte. So that will do it for our introduction of campaign finance. We're going to go into a lot more specifics over the next few days, if you're one of my students, about laws that have impacted campaign finance in the United States and different types of political action committees, such as super PACs, 527s, 501c4s, and others. And we'll also talk about how the Supreme Court and litigation have affected the landscape of campaign finance in the United States. As always, feel free to ask if you have any questions, and be sure you're keeping up with this unit and your syllabus if you're one of my students.